Hello, my name is Dr. Peter Dillard, and I'm making this video at the request of my colleague, Dr. Cynthia Nielsen. She has several students, several of you are interested in knowing more about the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and in particular, what are the similarities and differences between Wittgenstein's earlier philosophy and his later philosophical work. So what I want to do here is provide what I hope will be a constructive or useful introduction to some of these ideas for you. And I think the best place to begin here is to note that throughout his philosophical career, both early which is his most famous work early on is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and later in works like the Philosophical Investigations and Uncertainty and other things, but mostly philosophical investigations. Throughout his philosophical career, Wittgenstein holds that there's nothing wrong with our ordinary everyday language. Ordinary language is fine as it is. The problem is that when we begin to do philosophy, we get into trouble. We find ourselves getting caught in philosophical paradoxes or philosophical traps. All kinds of philosophical problems begin to loom when we get confused about ordinary language. Now, Wittgenstein has different answers to what being confused about ordinary language is philosophically, depending on whether we're talking about his earlier thinking or his later thinking. So we'll get to that in a minute. Let's begin with the earlier thinking in the Tractatus. And here Wittgenstein thinks that the reason we get into philosophical perplexity is that we do not have a sufficient understanding of the underlying logic of our language. So one way to put this in visual terms is that for the earlier Wittgenstein, we need to go vertical. We need to understand what the underlying logical structure of the sentences of our language, what the logical structure is. Now, what is an example of a philosophical confusion that arises in this way? Well, let me take a very simple one just to give you an idea of what he has in mind. So suppose that someone says, truly, well, Pegasus does not exist. That's a perfectly legitimate sentence. It's true. But what is it true in virtue of? Because if we think of Pegasus does not exist on this, on the same ground or in the same way that we think about, well, John is at the store or Mary went to the library, where in those sentences the proper names John or Mary refer to actually existing objects, then all of a sudden we find ourselves perplexed philosophically because Pegasus doesn't exist. In fact, that's the whole point of the sentence. So what is it that the proper name Pegasus picks out in that true sentence? It can't be an actually existing object like John or Mary because by definition Pegasus doesn't exist. And very quickly, one can get into all kinds of philosophical and metaphysical speculations. Well, maybe Pegasus is a non-existing object of some kind. And the philosopher Alexius Meinong took this position very, very seriously. Or maybe Pegasus is just an idea in the mind or whatever, and we're off to the races philosophically. Where Wittgenstein in the Tractatus would say, well, what we need to do here is nip it in the bud. Because if we commanded a clear view of the logical structure of our language, none of those questions would arise in the first place. So one way of getting clearer about the logical structure of that sentence, Pegasus does not exist, is to rewrite it using logical notation into something like, well, there is no X such that X is a horse, X has wings, and X was ridden by Perseus. Okay? So that sentence is true. We're using variables, the existential quantifier, and conjunction various logical connectives, the logical connective of conjunction. That sentence is true. Again, there's a negation. There is no X such that X is a horse, X has wings, and X is ridden by Perseus. That's true. Perfectly in order. But notice that the singular term Pegasus has disappeared, so we no longer have any questions about what that singular term or that proper name, to what does that refer? And Wittgenstein wants to take this idea very, very seriously in the Tractatus. He takes it as far as he can. His basic picture of logic is that any propositional sign, that is any indicative sentence, a sentence that's capable of being true and false, can be ultimately analyzed or broken down into a truth functional combination of what he calls elementary propositions. So the truth functions are things like and, or, if, then, not. Those are the truth functions. And Wittgenstein believes that any propositional sign in our ordinary language can ultimately be analyzed as a truth functional compound of elementary, that is ultimately simple propositions combined using those connectives in the way that P or not Q is a truth functional combination of P and Q using or, that the truth functional connective of disjunction, and the negation operator. He thinks that that holds for all of our language. Now, Wittgenstein never really tells us what elementary propositions are. He never gives us any examples of them, but he thinks that they have to be there in order for our language to make sense. In other words, if we didn't ultimately terminate in elementary, not further analyzable propositions, then none of our sentences would ever make any sense. He takes this idea very, very seriously in the Tractatus. He also, now a question that might arise here is, well, what about the logical constants themselves, or, if, then, and not? Do they refer to things? Do they express properties or functions or anything like? And Wittgenstein's idea is no. Let's just take a very, very simple example. P and Q, like Rover is in front of the door and Felix is behind the house, P and Q, something like that. And those of you who've studied elementary logic know that that conjunction has a truth table and that we can assign truth values to P and Q, and depending on what truth values we assign to those constituent propositions, the whole thing comes out as true or false. And in fact, the last line of that truth table shows that it's TTTF. In other words, TFFF. I got confused with disjunction there. I'm thinking about conjunction. TFFF, so that means that the only time that proposition, P and Q, is true is if both P and Q are true. If either P or Q is false, then the whole thing, P and Q, is false. And the last line of that truth table, TFFF, that for Wittgenstein is also a propositional sign, except that's one that shows the logic of the original proposition perspicuously, perfectly. We can see the logical structure of that proposition. And notice that the conjunction symbol is completely absent from that. All it is a row, T, F, F, F. The conjunction symbol has disappeared, and the same can be done for any other truth functional operator, he thinks, if we look at the truth table. And so this is what it is to command a perspicuous view of the underlying logic of our language. A second idea that's crucial to the Tractatus is Wittgenstein's picture theory of language, or better expressed perhaps, his picture or his theory of sentences as models of possible facts. And here Wittgenstein was inspired by the little toy models that people used in traffic courts in his day to depict an accident that had occurred. So, for example, you might have a model where the little toy red car is to the left of the blue car, and that depicts a possible situation in traffic court. Wittgenstein thinks that same idea can be applied to the propositional signs of our language. So if you say something like, well, Felix the cat is to the left of Rover the dog, right? So Felix is to the left of Rover. That sentence is a model that models or depicts, pictures, if you will, a possible fact, the fact in which Felix is to the left of Rover. And so Wittgenstein takes this idea very, very seriously. Now, in his later philosophy, he will reject both that particular view of logic and also the picture or the model theory of meaning, picture theory or the model theory of meaning of sentences. He will give that up. One reason that he gives up the picture theory is that Wittgenstein starts to think about the various uses of our ordinary language, how complex it is, and a lot of it is considerably different from simply making assertions about reality or possible reality that are either true or false. So let's just take an example. Suppose that somebody is ready to launch a race, and then the person shouts, "Go." Now, what is the logical structure of "go" in that situation? There are no names in it. There are no truth functional symbols in it. It doesn't seem to be it's not an indicative sentence. Or what if somebody, is working in the workshop and she strikes her hammer or her thumb with the hammer and says, "Oh hell," right? Ouch. Oh hell. What is the logical structure of that sentence? How do we become clear about that? Wittgenstein thinks that what we don't need to do here, that those sentences are perfectly in order as they stand, but getting clear about them or grasping their meaning or their sense doesn't have anything to do with analyzing them into truth functional compounds of elementary sentences. That's completely irrelevant to understanding the point of those sentences. So this is an idea that will become very, very important in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. But he still, as I said earlier, is convinced that philosophical problems arise when we become confused about our ordinary language. There's nothing wrong with our ordinary language as it stands, but sometimes, well, often, all the time, he thinks, when we do philosophy, we get into confusion about that. So what would be an example of this for Wittgenstein? Well, suppose that I think about two different language games. One of them is a language game in which I say, well, I have a book. Okay, I have a book. And another is a language game in which somebody says, well, so-and-so has a mind. Okay, so there's a temptation here or a danger that if we think about the language game that involves saying, well, so-and-so has a mind, as very much like the language game saying, well, I have a book. Well, here, book refers to a particular physical object that we can measure, that we can check, that we can show to other people. And if we think that the expression "a mind" is operating the same way in the other sentence in the other language game, then we might think, well, the mind must be a peculiar kind of object because it's an object like a book, but we can't show it to other people. We can't measure it. We can't, we can't display it or anything like that. So Wittgenstein would say, well, what we need to do here is not run those two language games together, confuse them. They're perfectly okay as they are, right? But we get into trouble when we run them together and start thinking about the language game that we play with expressions like "a mind" as on all fours with the language game we play with expressions like "a book." So Wittgenstein's this notion of language games, that the different language games that we actually play or might play with expressions, when we're making sense, this is a fundamental notion of Wittgenstein's later philosophy in the Investigations. It's very, very important. Now, I want to make a disclaimer here. I don't think that we should just rush to the conclusion here that Wittgenstein is saying, well, that shows that there is no such thing as a mind, as some kind of inner special object or soul or what have you. I think Wittgenstein would say we would have to attend to weightier philosophical considerations that someone might give for thinking that there is such a thing as an immaterial soul or a mind that's an immaterial thing, things like Descartes, the kinds of arguments that Descartes and others have made. But I think that what we can say for now is, from a Wittgensteinian perspective, just to give you a sense of where he's coming from, I think he would say, well, look, we don't want to get to that conclusion. We don't want to cheat or make it too easy on ourselves. Certainly, we don't want to infer that minds exist as some kind of inner special psychic objects. Simply because we run together these two language games. We're going to have to work harder than that. We need to be clear about our language, and if there's a case for thinking about the mind as something immaterial or what have you, we shouldn't make it too easy on ourselves. We need to do the work. It's going to take more work than that. I think he would also be skeptical about that, but the point is that for our purposes, all he needs to be saying is, well, let's not cheat. Let's not make it too easy on ourselves. And Wittgenstein would say, if you want to get clear about the mind, you need to very carefully consider the various language games we play, not just with that expression, but with other mental expressions or psychological expressions like expecting, believing, intending. remembering. I remembers, for example, there's the language game we play by when we say, well, I remember that 5 years ago I was on the island with you. Okay, let's try to think about that. Or I believe that the car is in the shop. I make the use of belief and its cognates to make claims. Or, well, I intend to be at the meeting 3 months from now, or something like that. Or I'm thinking about such and such, or I'm calculating such and such. All of these language games that we play with these expressions for Wittgenstein in his later thinking, in his later philosophy, they're perfectly in order, but we don't want to confuse them. We don't want to run them together and get ourselves into philosophical cul-de-sacs that don't seem to offer any way out. And the last thing that I will say for now is that for Wittgenstein, both early and late, the point of philosophy is not to construct theories. That's something for scientists to do. Philosophers shouldn't be constructing theories. Philosophers should be looking at the problems they get into and then trying to see what it is about how have we gone astray? What confusions lie at the root of this? We need to attend to the words that we use in everyday life. They're the only words that we have when it comes to formulating these problems, with an eye to dissolving those problems, or seeing through them, or seeing that there really aren't problems there. Whether he's right about that or wrong about that, I'm not going to say here. I'm simply trying to give you an idea of what his approach is, both early and late, although he pursues it in very different ways. As he once said in the Philosophical Investigations, my purpose, or the point of philosophy, is to show the fly out of the fly bottle. In other words, we're like the fly in the fly bottle, or to use a more recent version of that, the fly that's trapped on one side of the window, even though maybe at the top it's open and the fly can't figure out how to get out. We need to show the fly the way out, all right? Show that the fly thinks there's a problem here, there really isn't one, or that's a metaphor that Wittgenstein uses when he's thinking about philosophy and what we need to do when we're confronted with philosophical problems. So that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the feed under this YouTube video. I will post it on YouTube, and I'll also make it available to Dr. Nielsen. You can also ask her any questions, and she and I can discuss them. I hope this will help you, though, as you approach this material to have a better sense. And this is basically, this is just elementary stuff that I think it will help to know as you approach it. So I wish you all the best of luck with that. And as I say, if you have any questions, please let me know. Good luck, and I look forward to hearing from you if you do have questions. Thanks for your time.